What if the man sworn to protect you was the one hunting you? What if the badge meant to symbolize safety was the disguise of a killer? For years, the people of Irkutsk believed they were safe under the watch of the police. Patrol cars rolled through the frozen streets, their blue lights flickering across the Siberian snow. Citizens slept soundly, trusting the men in uniform to guard them from the darkness. But one of those men was the darkness. Mikhail Popkov wasn't just another officer. He was the city's most decorated predator. To his neighbors, he was a polite, soft-spoken family man. To his colleagues, a reliable cop who never complained, never took a sick day. But beneath the calm exterior, Popkov carried a twisted belief that some women deserved to die. Born in 1964 in Angarsk, Popkov grew up in a home filled with secrecy and resentment. His mother's infidelity left a scar that never healed. As he got older, that wound turned into disgust, a warped conviction that women were deceitful and corrupt. When he joined the police, that hatred found a weapon. His uniform wasn't just protection, it was camouflage. In the early 1990s, as post-Soviet Russia descended into chaos, Popkov began his secret war. Law enforcement was collapsing under corruption and poverty. That chaos was the perfect cover. On quiet nights, he cruised the streets in his patrol car, scanning for women walking alone after bars closed. Flashing his badge, he offered them rides home, the safest car in Yakutsk, or so they thought. Once they stepped inside, the illusion shattered. He'd drive them to the outskirts, to forests, abandoned knots, and the icy riverbanks where no one could hear them. There, he unleashed the rage he'd been hiding for decades. His weapons were the same ones used to enforce the law: knives, batons, police-issued tools. When the violence was over, he left the bodies in ditches or woods, cold and discarded like garbage. Then he'd go home, wash his hands, and kiss his wife goodnight. For years, Irkutsk became a city haunted by whispers. Women vanished, their bodies found mutilated near the same lonely roads. Locals began calling the killer the werewolf. But how do you hunt a monster who wears your badge? Popkov was everywhere, investigating his own murders, attending crime briefings, even comforting the families of his victims. His face was at every crime scene photo, not as a suspect, but as an officer. The killer and the cop were the same man, taking notes on his own crimes. There was one victim who survived, though barely. She had accepted a ride from a policeman, and the next thing she remembered was waking up in a hospital. All she could recall was the smell of a police uniform. It was the first crack in Popkov's perfect disguise. By 2012, investigators had DNA evidence from multiple victims, all pointing to a man within the force. They quietly collected samples from hundreds of officers. When they asked Popkov for his, he didn't hesitate. He smiled, confident that the system would never touch him. It was his final mistake. When the lab results came back, the truth exploded like a grenade inside the department. The killer they had hunted for 20 years was one of their own. Popkov was arrested while on vacation, and he didn't resist. Sitting across from detectives, he leaned forward, hands neatly folded, and calmly corrected them on the details of his murders. Which knife he used, which weapon matched which victim. He spoke like a man reviewing his paperwork, not his atrocities. At first, he confessed to 22 murders, but as the years passed, the numbers kept climbing. 56 more in 2018, several more in 2021, and new confessions as recently as 2023. By now, investigators believe he killed at least 80 women, possibly more. Each confession came without emotion, without guilt. When asked why, he said, "I was cleansing the streets." His wife and daughter refused to believe it at first. They had spent holidays together, traveled, posed for smiling photos, all while their husband and father was dumping bodies outside town. When the truth sank in, Elena Popkova reportedly destroyed every photograph of him in the house. The man she had loved had never existed. In court, Popkov sat motionless, his police posture unbroken. The only time he spoke was to correct a record, precise, unemotional, bureaucratic. In 2015, Mikhail Popkov was sentenced to life imprisonment in a Siberian maximum security colony, the same cold wilderness where he once buried his victims. In 2018, he received another life term for dozens of new murders. He will never leave that prison alive. As of 2025, the werewolf cop remains behind bars, expressionless, unrepentant, still insisting he was cleansing society. But what he really destroyed wasn't just human lives. It was the faith of an entire city. Because when the killer wears the uniform, every light on the street stops feeling safe. And in Irkutsk, that betrayal still echoes louder than the sirens.
And I don't know why I was just itching for trouble, I guess, because I knew I was going back east. But fortunately for the cop guy, his backup showed up.
He wasn't driven by rage, lust, or revenge. He didn't fit any profile. There was no signature, no pattern, no location to predict. Only death that arrived from nowhere and vanished the same way. What if the most dangerous serial killer of the 21st century was the one who planned for silence? Israel Keyes was the kind of killer investigators dread most: methodical, disciplined, and patient. He wasn't reckless or impulsive. He studied true crime cases, read FBI behavioral reports, and built his own system, a system that let him kill across the United States for over a decade without leaving a trace. Born in 1978 in Utah, Keyes was raised in an isolated religious household deep in the forests of Washington state. His family lived off-grid, no electricity, no schooling, no neighbors. By his teens, he was already obsessed with control and power. He tortured animals and broke into houses for the thrill. He later said he knew he was different, but he didn't see it as sickness. He saw it as purpose. After serving in the US Army in the late 1990s, Keyes settled in Alaska, where he ran a small construction business and raised a daughter. He appeared normal, polite, dependable, the guy who helped neighbors with their driveways. No one suspected that beneath the calm surface, he was engineering one of the most chilling patterns of modern crime. Keyes created what he called kill kits. These were small buckets or containers filled with everything he needed to murder: guns, duct tape, zip tapes, rope, and bottles of Drano to destroy evidence. He buried them across the country, in forests, under bridges, near remote rivers, then returned months or even years later to use them. His method was surgical. He'd pick a random state, fly in, rent a car under a fake name, and drive for hours to avoid detection. He'd select victims at random: a couple camping, a barista closing up, a man walking home at night, anyone who crossed his path. After the killing, he'd dispose of the bodies in places that might never be found, then fly home and return to his ordinary life as a father and business owner. There was no pattern, no link, no motive, just a ghost moving through America. The first known murder that eventually exposed him began on a cold February night in 2012 in Anchorage, Alaska. 19-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the late shift at a small coffee stand when a masked man approached. Surveillance footage showed her raising her hands, then turning off the shop lights. The stand was empty minutes later. For weeks, Anchorage was frozen in fear. Samantha had simply vanished. Keyes had taken her at gunpoint, forced her into his truck, and later murdered her. But what he did next revealed the terrifying precision of his planning. He left town the very next morning on a cruise with his girlfriend and daughter. When he returned, he withdrew ransom money using Samantha's debit card. making it seem like she was still alive. To sell the lie, he posed her body to appear lifelike, applied makeup to disguise the truth, placed a recent newspaper beside her, and took a new photograph to send to her family. It was a level of manipulation so cold and methodical, but even veteran investigators were shaken when they discovered what he'd done. Police traced the ATM withdrawals across several states, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, until they caught a break in March 2012. A state trooper in Texas stopped a white Ford Focus for driving slightly over the speed limit. Inside, he found cash, a mask, a gun, and Samantha Koenig's debit card. The driver calmly identified himself as Israel Keyes. Once in custody, Keyes didn't beg or deny. He negotiated. He told the FBI he would talk, but only under certain conditions. No media leaks, no public attention, and a quick execution date. He said he didn't want to live out his life in prison. He wanted control, even in death. Over months of interviews, Keyes revealed fragments of his crimes. Never full stories, just pieces. He admitted to at least 11 murders, but hinted at many more. At one point, investigators found a map he had drawn under his bed in jail. 11 crude skulls drawn in his own blood, believed to represent his confirmed victims. He talked about studying other killers like Bundy and BTK, criticizing them for being sloppy. He said he wanted to create a perfect puzzle, a series of murders with no way to connect them. What haunted investigators most wasn't the number of his victims, but how much they didn't know. Keyes had no victim type, no consistent weapon, and no geographic focus. He killed men, women, and couples, anyone convenient, but random. He buried kill kits across America, and even after his death, only a few have been found. On December 2nd, 2012, Israel Keyes ended his own life in his Anchorage jail cell, leaving behind a suicide note that read more like poetry than confession, a rambling, eerie manifesto about murder, darkness, and the void. It offered no names, no clues, just the taunting words of a man who died with his secrets intact. After his death, they continued to investigate dozens of unsolved disappearances in states Keyes is known to have visited. Israel Keyes didn't want fame. He wanted invisibility. No pattern, no name, no trace. And that's what makes him different from almost every serial killer before him. He wasn't killing to be remembered. He was killing to prove he could disappear. In the rugged wilderness of Alaska, hunters are gods. They know the land, the weather, and the way death hides beneath beauty. But in the 1970s and 90s, one man used that wilderness not to hunt animals, but to hunt women. His name was Robert Hansen, and behind the quiet face of a small-town baker, he built a private killing ground that turned the Alaskan frontier into his personal hunting preserve. Hansen's story begins in Esterville, Iowa, where he was born in 1939. The son of a strict Danish immigrant, he grew up shy, stuttering, and painfully awkward. He was bullied relentlessly for his speech and his severe acne. As a boy, he developed two obsessions: hunting and revenge. He spent hours with his father's rifle, learning to shoot with precision. But what he really longed to master was control. Control over the people who had humiliated him. By adulthood, Hansen had built a quiet life that seemed far removed from violence. He moved to Anchorage, Alaska in the late 1960s, opened a bakery, married, and became a father. To his neighbors, he was the picture of small-town decency, a churchgoer, a skilled hunter, and the kind of man who always had time to help a customer. But beneath that wholesome exterior was a boiling resentment toward women. He was furious that the same type of women who once mocked him now ignored him. In his mind, they owed him something, and he was going to take it. His victims were mostly dancers and sex workers from Anchorage's downtown strip, women who could vanish without sparking an immediate search. Hansen will lure them in with promises of money, adventure, or flights on his private plane. He owned a small bush aircraft, perfect for navigating Alaska's vast wilderness and perfect for disappearing his victims. Once they were aboard, the nightmare began. He would fly them deep into the woods or along the Mick River, land on a deserted gravel strip, and chain them in a cabin he kept hidden from the world. There, isolated and terrified, the women were forced to endure days of horror before he began his final ritual. Hansen would release them into the forest, giving them a head start, before hunting them down with a hunting rifle. He treated murder like sport, tracking them through the trees like prey, satisfied only when the pursuit ended in death. For years, bodies began to surface across Alaska, shallow graves found by hikers, hunters, and the elements. Many were too decomposed to identify. Investigators called it the work of the butcher-baker, a name whispered across Anchorage's bars and truck stops. But the man himself remained invisible, hiding in plain sight behind his bakery counter and his reputation as a family man. The first real break came in 1983, when a young woman named Cindy Paulson managed to escape. She had been kidnapped, handcuffed, and flown to Hansen's remote cabin, but while he was preparing his plane, she bolted barefoot across the tarmac and flagged down a passing truck driver. Police found her trembling, shackled, and terrified. She told them everything: the plane, the cabin, the hunts. At first, officers didn't believe her. Robert Hansen was a respected businessman, a husband, a hunter with no criminal record. But Cindy's story was too detailed to ignore. Anchorage police brought in the FBI's behavioral unit. Special Agent John Douglas, the profiler who had studied Bundy and other serial predators, analyzed the crime scene patterns. His assessment was clear. The killer was an experienced hunter, socially awkward, likely married, and respected in his community. Exactly, Robert Hansen. When detectives confronted Hansen, he denied everything, but a search warrant changed everything. Inside his home, investigators found jewelry belonging to missing women, hidden behind ceiling tiles. In his car and plane, they found ropes, restraints, and firearms. And in a small map hidden behind a headboard, they discovered 24 tiny X marks scattered across the Alaskan wilderness. Each X corresponded to a burial site. Confronted with the evidence, Hansen finally broke. In 1984, he confessed to killing 17 women and raping 30 more. He described his crimes in chilling, matter-of-fact detail: how he'd pick his victims, fly them out, and watch them run before ending their lives. He claimed the thrill wasn't in the kill itself, but in the hunt. Even veteran officers said it was one of the most disturbing investigations they had ever witnessed. In court, Hansen appeared small, quiet, and almost meek, the opposite of the monster his confessions revealed. When the judge handed down his sentence, life in prison plus 461 years, he barely reacted. He simply adjusted his glasses and stared at the floor. Robert Hansen was imprisoned at Spring Creek Correctional Center, where he spent 3 decades behind bars. He died in 2014 at the age of 75, leaving behind a legacy that still haunts Alaska. Many of the women he buried have never been identified, their names lost to the wilderness that became their grave. The people of Anchorage still remember how normal he looked. He turned Alaska's greatest strength, its vast, untamed beauty, into his accomplice. And for years, no one even realized that the most dangerous predator in the state wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was the man serving them pastries at sunrise.
And what was your reason for bringing your hands up to his neck? What was your understanding?
I thought he liked it rough.
Toronto's gay village was supposed to be a place of freedom, a safe haven carved out of decades of fear and prejudice. But between 2010 and 2017, men began to vanish. They weren't tourists or transients. They were beloved sons, partners, and friends. Their disappearances shared quiet similarities. No struggle, no witnesses, no bodies. For years, police believed they had simply left town. But the truth was far darker, buried in the most ordinary place imaginable. Flower planters, outside the home of a man everyone thought they knew. That man was Bruce MacArthur, a landscaper, a Santa Claus impersonator at the local mall, and a friendly face in the community. But behind the polite smile and tidy garb was a predator, hiding in plain sight. One who used charm, trust, and routine. MacArthur was born in 1951 in Ontario, raised on a farm where discipline was strict and emotion was scarce. As a young man, he married, had children, and lived what seemed like a normal suburban life. But as he approached his 40s, the facade began to crack. He struggled with his identity, eventually coming out as gay, but only after his marriage collapsed. Moving to Toronto's gay village, he tried to rebuild his life, immersing himself in the community's social scene. He was outgoing, generous, and always ready to lend a hand. No one knew that the same man who decorated patios with flowers was also cultivating death. MacArthur targeted vulnerable men, immigrants, refugees, or men who weren't fully out. Many came from Middle Eastern or South Asian backgrounds, already living in the margins, often too afraid to report harassment or violence. He met them on dating apps and in bars, luring them to apartments or homes under the guise of romance. Once inside, he turned their trust into a trap. Each disappearance followed a chilling pattern. A man would stop answering his phone, vanish from social media, and never show up to work again. Police opened missing persons files, but with no bodies and no clear evidence, cases went cold. Some officers even suggested the men had simply moved or returned to their home countries. By 2017, the community was losing patience. Activists demanded answers, accusing police of ignoring the disappearances because the victims were gay men of color. They were right about one thing: there was a serial killer among them, and he was hiding in broad daylight. The first crack in MacArthur's perfect mask came from his own carelessness. In January 2018, police executed a search warrant on his apartment, suspecting him in the disappearance of a man named Andrew Kinsman, a 49-year-old community volunteer who had been missing since June 2017. Investigators had found Kinsman's name scrawled in MacArthur's day planner. One word: Bruce. That single clue would blow open the case. When detectives entered MacArthur's small Toronto apartment, they found what they'd long been missing: hard evidence. On his computer, they discovered hundreds of photographs of men, some alive, some clearly not. The horror didn't end there. In his client's yards across Toronto, police found large planters filled with soil and flowers. Hidden inside those planters were human remains, carefully wrapped, buried, and disguised beneath the flowers he'd tended for years. As forensic teams dug through dozens of properties, the scale of MacArthur's crimes came into focus. He had been killing for nearly a decade, using his landscaping business as a cover to dispose of his victims in plain sight. By February 2018, police had identified 8 men. The community's grief was mixed with fury. For years, people had sounded the alarm, warning that someone was wrong, that someone was targeting men in the village. But no one had imagined the killer was the man they saw every day, driving a van full of soil and flowers through their streets. When the case went to trial, the evidence was overwhelming. MacArthur didn't fight it. On January 29, 2019, he pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. Investigators revealed that he had kept trophies, photographs, jewelry, and personal items as keepsakes of his crimes. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was handed down. Life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Because of his age, that effectively meant MacArthur would die behind bars. In prison, MacArthur lives quietly, rarely speaking to anyone. He spends his days reading and gardening in the facility's small courtyard, a chilling echo of the life he once led. The planters there, of course, are closely monitored. In Indonesia's vast island of Sumatra, magic and superstition have long lived alongside modern life. In small villages, people still visit shamans to heal sickness, find love, or attract wealth. But in the 1990s, one so-called holy man promised prosperity in exchange for ritual and delivered only death. His name was Ahmad Suradji, but locals called him Datuk. To them, he was a spiritual guide. To the world, he became known as the sorcerer of Sumatra, a man who confessed to killing 42 people, all in the name of black magic. Suradji's life began like many others in his region. He was born in 1949 near the city of Medan, the eldest son of a cattle breeder who was also a traditional healer. From a young age, Ahmad was surrounded by mysticism, charms, incantations, and the belief that spirits controlled fate. But while his father used his abilities to help others, Ahmad was drawn to something darker. He wanted not just respect, but power, the kind that would make people fear him. As he grew older, he began practicing as a dukun, a traditional shaman, claiming to perform rituals that could bring luck or cleanse bad spirits. He was charismatic and convincing. Villagers trusted him. They came to him with their most private desires: love, beauty, money, and he always had a spell to offer. What none of them knew was that his rituals came with a secret cost: human life. According to his later confession, Suradji claimed that one night he had a vision. In it, his deceased father appeared and told him that to achieve ultimate spiritual power, he had to kill 70 women and drink their saliva. Whether he truly believed this or used it as an excuse, no one knows. But from that night on, the killings began. His victims were always women, farmers, shopkeepers, students, who came willingly to his home, seeking his guidance. He would instruct them to wear white, a color symbolizing purity, and to come at night when the spirits were strongest. Once they arrived, he'd lead them to a sugarcane field near his house, where the ritual would supposedly take place. He'd dig a shallow hole and tell them to stand inside it, explaining that it would help channel spiritual energy. When they were waist deep in the earth, unable to move, he would wrap a piece of cloth around their necks and tighten it until they stopped breathing. Afterwards, he buried them right there, leaving only their heads above the soil for one final incantation. Then he covered their faces with dirt, as if part of some dark agricultural pattern. For years, the disappearances went unnoticed or were blamed on runaways. Many victims came from poor families or distant villages. Police reports were minimal, and superstitious fear kept others silent. Even Ahmad's 3 wives, all of whom were sisters, knew something was wrong, but didn't dare question him. One of them later admitted that she helped lure victims, believing the rituals were real. By 1997, the pattern began to unravel. The family of a young woman who had gone to visit Suradji grew suspicious when she never returned. Her father reported her missing, and police traced her less-known location to the shaman's home. When officers arrived, they noticed the strong smell of decay coming from the nearby sugarcane field. Digging through the soft earth, they uncovered a shallow grave, and then another, and another. By the time the search ended, they had found 42 bodies. Ahmad Suradji was arrested and brought to the Medan police station, where he initially denied everything. But when confronted with the evidence, he confessed calmly, explaining his motive with unnerving clarity. "My father came to me in a dream," he said. "He told me I must kill 70 women to gain power." He spoke as if describing a duty, not a crime. He even corrected officers when they misstated dates, eager to ensure his record was accurate. During interrogation, he described the details of his rituals, how he chose victims, how he buried them, and how he believed drinking their saliva gave him strength. At trial, the courtroom was packed with locals and journalists from around the world. People came expecting to see a madman, but instead they saw a calm, middle-aged man in a white shirt, smiling faintly as the charges were read. In 1998, Ahmad Suradji was found guilty of 42 counts of murder and sentenced to death by firing squad. One of his wives was also convicted as an accomplice and sentenced to life in prison. When asked if he feared death, Suradji shook his head. "I will return," he said. "The spirits will guide me." On July 10th, 2008, his prophecy ended. He was executed at dawn in a remote field outside Medan. Reports say he faced his executioners without a word, his eyes open until the final moment.
I feel absolutely no pity for any of those people I killed. I am a much better person than any of them. Life has treated me harshly, so I don't think about being punished. I'm a working man. I'm an executioner. And remember, punishment is up to the gods or the devil, and I don't think about it.
In the early 1990s, Ukraine was in chaos. The Soviet Union had collapsed, police forces were underfunded, and the countryside was filled with abandoned homes, wandering drifters, and desperate people trying to survive the transition. But amid the instability, one man turned that chaos into his playground. A man who would become one of Europe's deadliest killers, Anatoly Onoprienko, the media's Terminator. He didn't hunt for money, revenge, or even pleasure. He hunted for destruction itself. Onoprienko was born in 1959 in a small Ukrainian village near Zhytomyr. His childhood was defined by loss and cruelty. His mother died when he was just 4, and his father, unable to cope, abandoned him to an orphanage. There, Anatoly learned that survival meant dominance. He was beaten, humiliated, and ignored. As he grew older, he began to fantasize not about love or family, but about revenge against a world that had discarded him. When he reached adulthood, he tried to build a life. He studied forestry, joined the Navy, and worked odd jobs across Eastern Europe. But by the mid-1980s, he had already begun drifting, breaking into homes, stealing, setting fires. His early crimes were chaotic but revealing. He didn't just steal, he destroyed. Even small acts of violence seemed to fill him with a kind of satisfaction that no ordinary life could replace. By 1989, he escalated to murder. His first confirmed killings were a family of 10, a mother, father, their children, and relatives. Police at first thought it was a robbery gone wrong, but the brutality was unnecessary, the method too deliberate. When the investigation went nowhere, Onoprienko vanished, disappearing into Europe for several years. He resurfaced in 1995, and this time he unleashed chaos on an unprecedented scale. Over the next year, Ukraine became a landscape of fear. Small villages would wake to silence, homes burned to the ground, entire families shot in their sleep. Onoprienko's spree was merciless and random. He targeted isolated households, breaking in during the night armed with a shotgun. Once inside, he killed everyone, leaving no witnesses. Then, he'd set the house on fire and move on to the next. His victims weren't chosen for who they were, but for where they lived. Alone, vulnerable, easy targets. In one interview, he admitted that he killed families to eliminate witnesses after robbing them, but his latest statements contradicted that entirely. "I killed because it was my mission," he said. "I was cleansing." At crime scenes, investigators found eerie signs of pattern. The same caliber weapon, the same post-fire aftermath. Police had never seen anything like it. Ukraine's fragile post-Soviet infrastructure made investigation almost impossible. Communication between regions was slow, and there was no centralized database. Onoprienko exploited that disorganization perfectly. As panic spread, rumors filled the countryside. Stories of a demon, a man possessed, a supernatural executioner roaming the night. Locals began locking doors for the first time in generations. Police patrols doubled, but it made little difference. Onoprienko moved constantly, crossing regional borders, leaving terror behind him. His behavior grew even more erratic. He killed a family of 5 one night, then stopped a passing motorist and murdered him for no reason. He began speaking to the voices in his head, claiming divine command. In one case, he walked into a farmhouse, killed the couple and their children, then sat down and ate their food before setting the house on fire. By the spring of 1996, his body count had reached 52, making him the most prolific mass murderer in modern European history. The government, under enormous pressure, launched a massive manhunt. Thousands of officers scoured villages, interviewing drifters and checking weapons permits. For months, nothing worked, until one small mistake gave him away. In April 1996, police stopped a man in the town of Zhytomyr who was carrying an illegal shotgun and several stolen items linked to one of the murdered families. That man was Anatoly Onoprienko. When investigators entered his apartment, they found a cache of weapons, ammunition, and keepsakes from victims: watches, jewelry, children's toys, photographs. It was a museum of death. During interrogation, Onoprienko wasted no time pretending innocence. He confessed almost immediately, even bragging about his efficiency. When asked why he had slaughtered entire families instead of just robbing them, he gave a chilling answer: "When I kill, I am God." The trial that followed was one of the most watched in Ukrainian history. Reporters filled the courtroom, and the public demanded his execution. Onoprienko remained eerily calm, sometimes smiling, sometimes muttering prayers. He showed no remorse, often correcting the prosecutor's statements, making sure his record of death was accurate. Psychiatrists declared him legally sane. He wasn't driven by mental illness, only by choice. "I am not crazy," he told them. "I am just different." In 1999, Anatoly Onoprienko was sentenced to death. As Ukraine moved toward joining the European Union, the government commuted all death sentences to life imprisonment. Instead of facing execution, he was locked away in a solitary cell for the rest of his life. Inside prison, guards described him as detached and emotionless, reading the Bible and claiming to have found God. But when journalists visited him in 2006, they found the same cold arrogance. "I regret nothing," he said. "I was chosen." Onoprienko died in 2013 at the age of 54, still behind bars. He once called himself the instrument of fate, but the truth is simpler. He wasn't a soldier or an avenger. He was an orphan who decided the world owed him blood. In the heart of rural China, among endless fields of wheat and silent villages, there lived a man who carried no name in the public record until it was too late. No one noticed him arriving, and no one saw him leave, only the carnage left behind. Between 1999 and 2003, he committed one of the deadliest murder sprees in world history, slaughtering 67 people in their homes with nothing but a hammer and the hunger for annihilation. His name was Xinhai, and even in a country of over 1 billion people, he stood out as a nightmare that defied comprehension. Yang was born in 1968 in Henan province, into poverty so deep that childhood dreams meant little more than surviving the next day. He was the fourth of 5 children, quiet and withdrawn, with a look that never quite fit his age, always older, always tired. His father was a poor farmer, his mother a laborer, and education meant little in a family that needed hands more than minds. By all accounts, Yang was intelligent but antisocial, preferring isolation to play. When classmates mocked his ragged clothes, He didn't argue. He stared at them in silence until they looked away. By his teens, he had left home and begun drifting. He took temporary factory jobs, slept in abandoned buildings, and started stealing to survive. Each time he was caught, he grew more detached, more resentful. Prison hardened him. He served multiple sentences for burglary, and when he was finally released in 1999, he was no longer just a thief. He was a man who hated everything around him. "Society owes me," he told investigators years later. "I wanted to take revenge." And so he did. His killings began in small farming villages scattered across central China, places so isolated that help was hours away. He chose his victims at random. One night it might be a family of farmers, another a couple sleeping in a brick house near a canal. He would break in silently, armed with a hammer or a pickaxe, and murder everyone inside. No one was spared. He struck fast, methodically, then vanished before dawn. There was no pattern beyond geography and brutality. Sometimes he took money or small valuables, but robbery was never the motive. He told police later that he enjoyed the process. As his body count rose, panic spread through the countryside. Local police were overwhelmed. The villages he targeted were miles apart, sometimes even in different provinces, making it nearly impossible to connect the crimes. Each scene looked the same: a broken door, smashed furniture, and lifeless bodies. China launched one of the largest manhunts in its modern history. Thousands of officers were mobilized, roadblocks were set up across provinces, and every drifter was questioned. Still, Yang remained invisible. There was no personal connection between him and his victims, which made profiling him almost impossible. His capture in November 2003 happened not through detective work, but by pure chance. In Kangzhou, Hebei province, police stopped a suspicious man during a routine ID check. He had no documents and was behaving nervously. When they fingerprinted him, the database returned an alert. The man was wanted for murder in multiple provinces. It was Yang Xinhai. At first, officers didn't believe what they had stumbled upon. But once he was brought in for questioning, Yang confessed almost immediately. When asked why he did it, he said simply, "Killing people is very normal. It's the same as eating or sleeping." The trial lasted less than an hour. He was found guilty of 67 murders and 23 assaults, making him the deadliest serial killer in Chinese history. Even in handcuffs, Yang showed no emotion. When reporters asked if he regretted anything, he shrugged. "I don't care whether I live or die," he said. "It makes no difference to me." Some psychologists later argued that his crimes reflected more than individual madness. They were the dark mirror of poverty, neglect, and alienation that had consumed rural China in the 1990s. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2004, China executed him. The newspapers printed a single line the next day: "The monster killer has been put to death." And just like that, the ghost of rural China disappeared, leaving behind 67 graves and a question no one can ever truly answer. How does a man become nothing but the urge to kill? Hospitals are built on trust. Patients surrender their lives to strangers in white coats and scrubs, believing that compassion is automatic and safety is guaranteed. But in Germany, between 2000 and 2005, one nurse turned that trust into a death sentence. His name was Niels Högel, and he is now known as the most prolific killer in modern German history. A man who murdered not out of hatred or greed, but for the thrill of playing God. Högel was born in 1976 in Wilhelmshaven, a quiet port city on the North Sea. His father was a nurse, respected and kind, and Niels followed in his footsteps. Colleagues later described him as helpful, even likable, the kind of man who cracked jokes during night shifts and always volunteered for overtime. But behind the easy charm was a restless ego that fed on adrenaline. He didn't want to heal people. He wanted to save them, even if he had to push them to the edge of death first. By his late 20s, Högel was working in intensive care at Oldenburg Hospital. It was a demanding job, long hours, critically ill patients, and constant pressure. Yet co-workers began to notice something strange. Patients under Högel's care suffered sudden cardiac arrests far more often than those treated by anyone else. When he was around, the emergency alarm seemed to sound more frequently. But every time, he was the first to respond, rushing in with defibrillators, shouting orders, performing resuscitation like a hero in a medical drama. He basked in the praise. Nurses whispered that he had golden hands for bringing people back from the brink. Supervisors gave him commendations. No one wanted to believe that the collapses themselves were deliberate. In reality, Högel was injecting patients with overdoses of heart medication, primarily agmaline and lidocaine, drugs that caused arrhythmias and cardiac arrest. Then, he'd discover the emergency and attempt to revive them. Sometimes it worked. Many times it didn't. Each time, he played both executioner and savior, watching life fade and deciding whether to return it. The motive, he later admitted, was excitement. He called it addiction to the feeling of resuscitation. When the alarms went off and everyone looked to him for help, he felt alive. It gave me a rush, he told investigators. By 2002, the death toll at Oldenburg Hospital had climbed dramatically. Supervisors quietly transferred him to a smaller facility in Delmenhorst, rather than report suspicions. The pattern followed him. In Delmenhorst, cardiac emergencies spiked again. Within months, mortality rates tripled. Still, no one intervened. Some doctors even defended him, insisting that his patients were already terminally ill. Everything changed in 2005. A colleague caught him standing over a patient with a syringe he wasn't authorized to use. Minutes later, the patient crashed. When staff revived the man, toxicology tests revealed a lethal drug in his system, one that had never been prescribed. For the first time, Högel was exposed. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder. During the initial investigation, he confessed to several other deaths. Almost casually, "There are many more," he said, "but I can't remember them all." That statement triggered one of the largest forensic inquiries in German history. Police exhumed hundreds of bodies from cemeteries across northern Germany. Teams of toxicologists tested tissue samples, searching for traces of the drugs Högel had used. The results were staggering. Dozens of confirmed poisonings, many more suspected. Investigators believed he had killed at least 100 people, possibly more than 300. During questioning, Högel showed little remorse. He claimed he wanted to help patients by ending their suffering, but that lie didn't survive long. When pressed, he admitted that the real reason was pride. "I wanted people to see me as a hero," he said. "I wanted applause." His first trial in 2008 covered just a handful of cases, earning him a 15-year sentence. But as new evidence surfaced, prosecutors reopened the investigation. By 2017, he was facing charges for 97 murders. The proceedings took place in a packed courtroom in Oldenburg, where families of victims filled every seat. Psychiatrists testified that he suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, not insanity, but a pathological need for admiration. In June 2019, the court found him guilty of 85 murders. Their investigators believe the real number could exceed 300, since many bodies were cremated before testing could be done. His sentence: life in prison, with no possibility of parole until at least 2005. The German federal court upheld that decision the following year. Even after conviction, Högel's case forced Germany to confront a chilling truth. For years, hospitals had quietly transferred suspicious staff rather than report them, afraid of scandal. The health system's culture of silence had allowed a murderer to thrive inside its walls. Today, Niels Högel spends his days in solitary confinement in a high-security German prison, banned from contact with other inmates. He reads medical books and religious texts, sometimes writing letters to former colleagues he once deceived. None of them reply. His story isn't just about one man's evil. It's about trust turned lethal. For every life he ended, there was a family that believed their loved one was in safe hands. And that's what makes Niels Högel's crimes so devastating. South Africa, mid-1990s. The nation was still celebrating the end of apartheid, a rebirth built on hope and reconciliation. But beneath that optimism, in the townships east of Hosanabak, fear was spreading. Women were vanishing, dozens of them, their bodies turning up along dusty roads and open fields. The murders formed a triangle between Etteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland, giving police the name that would haunt the country, the ABC murders. The killer was a man no one suspected, polite, soft-spoken, even charming. His name was Moses Sithole, and for 2 years, he terrorized post-apartheid South Africa, killing at least 38 women in what became one of the most brutal and calculated serial murder cases in the country's history. Sithole was born in 1964 in Vosloorus, a township outside Johannesburg. His childhood was marked by abandonment and abuse. When he was 5, his father died, and his mother, unable to care for her children, sent them to an orphanage. That orphanage would shape the man he became, a place where beatings were routine and cruelty was a daily ritual. As a young man, he tried to rebuild himself. He found work as a miner, then as a security guard. He dressed well, spoke softly, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd endured hardship and survived it. To those who knew him, he seemed ambitious, even kind. But there was another side, a growing resentment toward women that began after a failed relationship and a conviction for sexual assault in 1987. He served 6 years in prison, and by the time he was released, the part of him that could feel empathy was gone. The killings began in 1994, less than a year after Nelson Mandela became president. South Africa was changing, but law enforcement was still underfunded and fragmented. The perfect environment for someone like Sithole to operate. He developed a method that combined manipulation and precision. Posing as a businessman recruiting women for charity jobs, he'd approach victims at train stations, markets, or bus stops. He was persuasive, showing fake credentials and offering them work at a supposed children's organization. Once they agreed to accompany him, he led them to secluded fields or abandoned industrial areas, always within the same rough triangle, Atteridgeville, Boksburg, Cleveland. There, his charm vanished. Sithole would attack his victims, overpower them, and strangle them with their own clothing. The killings were brutal, but fast. Then he'd disappear, blending back into everyday life as if nothing had happened. For months, police struggled to connect the dots. South Africa's transition era had overwhelmed the system. Databases were incomplete, and communication between departments was poor. Women kept vanishing. Locals whispered about a demon haunting the townships, a curse born from the country's violent past. By 1995, the scale of the murders could no longer be ignored. The discovery of multiple bodies near Boksburg triggered a nationwide investigation. Forensic evidence linked the crimes through identical patterns, ligature strangulation, sexual assault, and the distinctive use of victims' own clothing. The press began calling the killer the ABC Strangler. The police brought in top detectives from across the country. Among them was Piet Bijleveld, one of South Africa's most renowned investigators. They soon identified a key clue. Several of the murdered women had last been seen with a man named Moses Sithole, who had once worked for a charity organization called Youth Against Human Abuse. The organization was real, but Sithole had been fired years earlier for theft. He was now using its name to lure victims. When police raided his last known address, they found documents, photographs, and clothing belonging to multiple missing women. But Sithole was gone. For weeks, he remained on the run, taunting police through phone calls to journalists and investigators. In one call to a newspaper, he coolly told a reporter, You are talking to the man they are looking for. He even blamed his victims, saying they deserved it for lying and cheating men. The hunt for him became one of the largest in South African history. His face was on every front page, every TV broadcast. Finally, in October 1995, police tracked him to Johannesburg. When they closed in, he attacked an officer with a machete, slashing wildly before being shot and captured. Even wounded, Sithole remained eerily calm. In interrogation, he confessed to 38 murders and 40 rapes, though investigators suspected the real number was higher. The trial, held in 1997, lasted nearly a year and became a national obsession. Survivors and victims' families filled the courtroom, staring at the man who had destroyed their lives. Sithole showed little remorse, often smirking as evidence was read. He accused the police of framing him and claimed the women had consented to go with him, but the evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, witness testimony, and DNA all pointed directly to him. The judge called him a man without conscience, without mercy, without humanity. He was sentenced to 2,410 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down in South African history. The court ruled he would be eligible for parole only after serving 930 years, an impossible term designed to ensure he would never walk free. In the years since, Sithole has remained largely silent behind bars, occasionally granting interviews in which he insists he was misunderstood. But even now, more than 2 decades later, the shadow of his crimes lingers over South Africa. Moscow, early 2000s. A city of concrete towers, cold parks, and restless souls trying to rebuild after the fall of the Soviet Union. The streets were busy, but the loneliness was everywhere. And inside that loneliness, one man found his obsession. He wasn't looking for wealth or fame. He was chasing a number, 64, the number of squares on a chessboard. His goal, one murder for each square. His name was Alexander Pichushkin, and he became one of the most methodical serial killers Russia had ever seen. The man the press would call the chessboard killer. Pichushkin was born in 1974 in Moscow's bleak southern district of Bitsa Park, a massive sprawl of forest and apartment blocks. When he was a child, his father abandoned the family, leaving him to be raised by his mother in a cramped Soviet flat. By all accounts, he was shy but intelligent, quiet but intense. That changed when he fell from a swing at age 4. The head trauma altered his personality. Doctors would later say it damaged the parts of his brain that controlled empathy and impulse. As he grew older, his obsession with control and strategy began to surface. He became fascinated by chess, not the game itself, but the domination behind it. He said later, life and death are the same as a chess match. You make the move, you win, you control. In his teenage years, he drifted between jobs, spending hours in Bitsa Park, playing chess with pensioners who gathered around concrete tables in the cold. But behind his calm demeanor, darkness was taking shape. He felt invisible, unwanted, and angry, especially after the death of his grandfather, the only person who ever treated him with kindness. That death snapped something in him. He began killing animals, filming their suffering on his home camera. It was practice. Pichushkin's first known murder came in 1992, and he was just 18. He lured a classmate into the park under the pretense of showing him a secret spot, then struck him in the head with a hammer. The boy's body was found days later, and police wrote it off as a robbery gone wrong. For the next decade, Pichushkin stayed dormant, or at least undetected. But by the early 2000s, he was ready to start again, this time with purpose. He developed a routine. His victims were often elderly men he met while playing chess in the park. He'd invite them for a drink, to celebrate friendship, then lead them to secluded parts of the forest. Once there, he'd strike them from behind with a hammer, then drop their bodies into the park's sewage pits or manholes. Sometimes, he'd wedge a vodka bottle into the wound, a twisted signature left like a calling card. Pichushkin kept meticulous notes. In his apartment, investigators later found a chessboard on which he had marked each square with the victim's number. For every murder, he filled one square. Between 2001 and 2006, at least 49 people vanished in and around Bitzer Park. Most were homeless, elderly, or forgotten, the kind of people whose disappearances barely made headlines. Police knew there was a pattern, but Moscow's vast sprawl made it nearly impossible to connect the dots. Each crime scene was similar, but the killer left almost no trace. It wasn't until 2006 that his arrogance finally betrayed him. One of his victims, a supermarket worker named Marina Moskaliova, left a note for her son, saying she was going for a walk with Sasha. When she didn't come home, her son told the police. They pulled surveillance footage from her apartment complex, which showed her leaving with Pichushkin. Days later, her body was found in Bitzer Park. The evidence was undeniable. When officers entered his apartment, they discovered the chessboard, meticulously filled with numbers. There were 49 marked squares, each representing a confirmed victim. Pichushkin claimed he had killed more, possibly over 60. A life without murder, he told police, is like a life without food. During interrogation, he was eerily calm, almost polite. He explained his methods with the precision of a mathematician. It was never about hatred, he said. I killed because it was interesting. I felt like God, deciding who lives and who doesn't. When detectives asked why he'd stopped at 49, he smiled and said, I didn't stop. You stopped me. The trial in 2007 was a national spectacle. He sat behind the glass enclosure, reserved for Russia's most dangerous criminals, expressionless, as prosecutors listed the names of his victims. The only time his composure broke was when the judge referred to him as mentally ill. Pichushkin interrupted, insisting, I am sane. I knew what I was doing. He was convicted of 49 murders, though investigators still believe the true number is higher. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement, the harshest penalty available in Russia. Even in prison, he remains proud of his record. In interviews, he has compared himself to chess grandmasters, claiming that his murders were an art form of strategy. In 2025, Russian authorities announced that Pichushkin was preparing to confess to 11 additional killings committed between 1992 and 1994, cases that may finally complete his self-imposed chessboard. Psychologists who've studied him say he represents a new kind of killer, one who murders not for emotion, but for structure, for order. And what makes him unforgettable isn't just the number of lives he took, but the reason why. To him, every life was just another move. And when he lost, it wasn't because his opponent outsmarted him. It was because his game finally ended. From the cop who hunted under the badge, to the nurse who killed to feel like a hero, these 10 men turned trust, power, and human life into their playgrounds. They were fathers, officers, doctors, and neighbors, faces of normalcy hiding unimaginable cruelty. Each one shattered the illusion that evil is easy to recognize. These are the manipulators who became monsters, the ordinary men who proved that the most terrifying killers aren't found in shadows, they walk among us. They are, without question, some of the most evil serial killers the world has ever seen. If you found this journey into their twisted stories compelling, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode. And tell us in the comments which killer's story left you the most disturbed.